The morning of August 4th, 1943, brought a journey unlike any other for men who had believed themselves warriors of the master race. Among them was Friedrich Hoffmann, a 22-year-old machine gunner from the 21st Panzer Division. He had fought under Rommel in the scorching sands of Tunisia, convinced by years of Nazi propaganda that capture by the Americans meant torture, humiliation, starvation, perhaps a bullet to the head. The propaganda had been specific and vivid. Americans were mongrels, a nation of criminals and racial inferiors who would show no mercy to German soldiers. But when the Liberty ship's hatches creaked open at Norfolk Harbor, the bright Virginia sun revealed something that contradicted everything they had been told. American soldiers stood in neat formations along the dock, their faces showing neither the hatred nor bloodlust the Germans expected. Instead, there was only the weary efficiency of men performing another routine task in an endless war. Behind them, the Virginia coastline hummed with activity that spoke of a nation whose industrial might had barely been dented by nearly 2 years of global conflict. Cranes swung massive loads from ships to shore, trucks rolled in steady streams along the waterfront, and in the distance, factory smokestacks sent plumes into the summer sky. It was a scene of such normalized productivity that it seemed to mock the total war mobilization that had consumed every aspect of German life. Behind Friedrich, veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had once swept across North Africa like an unstoppable storm, muttered prayers in various dialects of German. Some were Bavarians, some Prussians, some Austrians pressed into Wehrmacht service. All shared the same fear. They had heard stories, whispered in the prison cages of North Africa, of what Americans did to captured Germans. The stories grew worse with each telling, until by the time they boarded the ships in Oran, many expected to be thrown to sharks in the Atlantic, or worked to death in chain gangs upon arrival. The Nazi propaganda machine had painted Americans as savage gangsters, ruled by Jews and Negroes who would take vengeance on captured German soldiers. Yet as they descended the gangplanks, their legs shaky from weeks at sea, what greeted them was neither rifle butts nor shouted curses, but military police directing them with hand gestures and broken German phrases. Raus, raus, aber langsam, out, out, but slowly. One MP called, his accent terrible but his tone lacking malice. The efficiency was almost antiseptic, processing prisoners like any other wartime logistics challenge. Then came the moment that would haunt Friedrich's memory for decades. An American sergeant approached with a cardboard box, handing each prisoner a brown paper bag. Friedrich took his with trembling hands, certain it contained some form of humiliation, perhaps rotten food to mock their hunger, or propaganda leaflets to break their spirit. He opened it cautiously, as if it might explode. Inside lay 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, an apple, and a chocolate bar. But it was the sandwiches that made him stop breathing. They were made with white bread, soft, pillowy white bread that he could smell through the wrapper. In Germany, white bread had become a memory, a pre-war luxury replaced by the heavy black Kriegsbrot made from sawdust, potatoes, and whatever grain could be scraped together. This bread was so white it seemed to glow in the sunlight, spread with actual butter and filled with thick slices of bologna. Friedrich bit into the sandwich and the taste nearly overwhelmed him. The bread dissolved on his tongue like a cloud, the butter rich and real, not the petroleum-based substitute Germany had been using for years. Around him, other prisoners were discovering the same impossibility. One man, a sergeant from Munich, held his sandwich up to the light as if examining a religious relic. Another was crying openly, not from fear or relief, but from the cognitive dissonance of enemies providing food that their own government could no longer supply. The chocolate bar posed another problem. Real chocolate, not the turnip-based substitute that Germany had been producing since 1941. The wrapper read, Hershey's, in letters that seemed absurdly cheerful. Some men ate theirs immediately, unable to resist. Others secreted them away, unable to believe such treasure wouldn't be taken back. From the docks, They were loaded not into the cattle cars they expected, but onto actual passenger trains. The trains had cushioned seats, windows that opened, and a sense of civilian normalcy that seemed surreal for prisoner transport. Through the windows drifted an impossible mixture of scents: industrial oil, coal smoke, and something else, the sweet, yeasty aroma of baking bread from somewhere in the city. It was this last smell that broke something in many of the men. In Germany, bakeries had closed one by one as flour disappeared and fuel became too precious to waste on civilians. The trains would carry them to various camps across the American South and Southwest, as Texas had approximately twice as many POW camps as any other state. But Friedrich's group was destined for Virginia, where several camps were being established to house the flood of prisoners from North Africa. As the train rolled through the Virginia countryside, the evidence of American plenty only grew more overwhelming. They passed farms with fields stretching to the horizon, crops growing in neat rows that spoke of mechanized efficiency. Cattle grazed in pastures, hundreds of them, fat and healthy. In Germany, most livestock had been slaughtered years ago, either for the military or to feed starving civilians. Here, cows stood in fields, as if war was something that happened to other countries. The train stopped at a small station for water and coal, and through the windows the prisoners could see American civilian life continuing uninterrupted. A small town's main street was visible, shops open for business, people going about their daily routines. A grocery store's window revealed shelves stocked with goods, canned foods, boxes of cereal, and stacks of that miraculous white bread. Women pushed baby carriages along sidewalks, their clothes colourful and clean. Children played in a nearby park, their shouts and laughter drifting through the summer air. It was a scene of such ordinary prosperity that it seemed almost obscene to men who had left cities where every window was taped against bomb blasts, where children scavenged for scraps. One guard, perhaps feeling generous or simply bored, bought several bottles of Coca-Cola from a vending machine at the station and passed them through the windows to the prisoners. Friedrich held his bottle, examining the curved glass, the condensation beading on its surface. He had heard of this drink, but never tasted it. The first sip was a revelation, sweet, fizzy, utterly unlike anything in his experience. But it was the casual waste of it that struck him most. Sugar and caffeine combined in a luxury beverage, available at any train station, given to enemy prisoners without a second thought. In Germany, sugar was more precious than gold, coffee a distant memory replaced by roasted acorns. By evening, their train arrived at their destination, one of the camps in the Virginia military complex that would house thousands of German prisoners. As they would learn, they were part of a massive influx, as 425,000 German prisoners lived in 700 camps throughout the United States during World War II. The camp gates opened to reveal neat rows of barracks, electric lights already glowing in the gathering dusk. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, but they seemed almost ceremonial compared to the brutal efficiency of German camps. The wire fencing was there, yes, but beyond it, they could see American military personnel going about their duties with a casualness that spoke of routine rather than fear. They were processed efficiently, registered, fingerprinted, photographed, given POW uniforms marked with large PW letters on the back, assigned to barracks. Throughout it all, the American guards maintained a professional detachment that was neither cruel nor friendly, simply businesslike. No one was beaten for moving too slowly. No one was screamed at for not understanding English. It was a bureaucratic process, as if processing thousands of enemy prisoners was just another administrative task in the vast American war machine. That first night, as Friedrich lay on his cot, an actual cot with a mattress and blankets, not straw on concrete, he pulled out the chocolate bar from lunch. He had saved it, still unable to believe it was real. In the darkness of the barracks, he unwrapped it slowly, the paper crackling loud in the silence. The smell hit him first, rich and sweet, nothing like the ersatz chocolate made from turnips and saccharin that Germany had been producing for years. He broke off a small piece and let it melt on his tongue, the sweetness almost painful after years of deprivation. Around him, other men were conducting similar private rituals. Some ate their chocolate immediately, others rewrapped it carefully, saving it for some future moment when they might need proof that this day had been real. Through the barracks windows came the alien sounds of an American night. Trucks rumbling on distant highways, the low hum of electrical generators, and from somewhere the sound of a radio playing jazz music. The normalcy of it, enemies listening to entertainment while imprisoned, was another crack in their worldview. The next morning arrived with a bugle call that was almost melodious compared to the harsh bark of German reveille. Friedrich and his barracks mates stumbled out for roll call, steeling themselves for the prisoners' breakfast they expected. Thin gruel, perhaps some ersatz coffee, a heel of black bread if they were lucky. They were marched to a mess hall, and what they found inside shattered their expectations entirely. The mess hall was a large wooden building with screens to keep out flies and electric lights hanging from the rafters, electricity used casually for prisoner comfort. Long tables were already set with metal trays, cups, and actual utensils, not just spoons, but forks and knives. But it was the smell that stopped them in their tracks. Bacon frying, eggs cooking, real coffee brewing. The aroma was so intense, so impossible, that several men simply stood in the doorway, unable to move forward. At the serving line, American cooks, including several Negro soldiers, which added another layer of shock for Germans raised on racial ideology, ladled out portions that seemed impossible. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitute that had become standard in Germany. Strips of bacon, crispy and glistening with fat. Hash brown potatoes. Toast made from that miraculous white bread, with butter, actual butter, not margarine or some petroleum-based substitute, sitting in dishes on every table. All prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers as required by the Geneva Convention. This simple requirement, which the Americans followed to the letter, created a disparity so stark it broke something in many of the prisoners. By 1943, German civilians were surviving on official rations of fewer than 1,500 calories per day, often much less. A typical German breakfast might be ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and a thin slice of black bread spread with turnip jam if anything was available to spread at all. Meat had become a memory for most, eggs a fantasy, real butter something from dreams of peacetime. Friedrich took his tray with shaking hands. The weight of it, the abundance, seemed wrong. He sat at a table with other members of his unit, and for several minutes none of them could speak. They ate in silence, slowly, as if too sudden a movement might make it all disappear. One man, a corporal from Hamburg, whose family had been bombed out twice, began to cry silently as he ate, tears rolling down his cheeks and dropping onto his eggs. No one mocked him. They all understood. The gap between what they were eating and what their families had for breakfast was a chasm too wide to bridge. After breakfast came an orientation session that provided another shock. The camp commander, speaking through an interpreter, explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would not be forced to work, though volunteers would be paid for their labor. The Geneva Convention's mandate of equal treatment for prisoners also meant they were paid American military wages. The rate would be 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, the same base pay as an American private. They could use this money at the camp store to buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing materials, and other items. The interpreter, himself a German-American sergeant, explained the camp rules with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested this was all routine. There would be 3 meals a day. The barracks had hot water for showers. Medical care was available for any health issues. They could write letters home through the Red Cross. They could receive packages. There were educational programs for those interested. Sports equipment was available. The camp had a library. Movies were shown twice a week. With each amenity listed, the cognitive dissonance grew stronger. In German stalags, Allied prisoners were lucky to receive 1 meal a day, lucky if it contained any nutrition at all. Here, they were being told about hot showers and movies, as if imprisoning enemies in comfort was perfectly normal. One prisoner raised his hand and asked, in halting English, if this was some kind of trick. The American commander looked genuinely puzzled. "What trick?" he asked through the interpreter. "This is how we run our POW camps." That afternoon, those who volunteered for work details were divided into groups. Friedrich found himself with 30 other men assigned to agricultural work. They were loaded onto trucks, not cattle cars, but actual trucks with benches, and driven through the Virginia countryside. The guards sat relaxed, rifles across their laps but not pointed at anyone. Some even offered cigarettes to prisoners who spoke enough English to ask. The casualness of it, enemies sharing tobacco, was another small demolition of everything they'd been taught. They arrived at a farm that seemed to stretch forever, fields of corn and tobacco extending to the horizon. The farmer, a middle-aged man named Anderson, greeted them with a nod and showed them what needed to be done through gestures and simple English words. Weeding, hoeing, general maintenance, nothing harsh or punitive. He then largely left them to work under the supervision of just 2 guards, who found shade under a tree and seemed content to let the prisoners work at their own pace. At noon, work stopped for lunch. The prisoners expected bread and water, the standard meal for labourers in German camps. Instead, Mrs. Anderson appeared with baskets of food: sandwiches made with white bread, thick with ham and cheese, apples from their orchard, cookies that crumbled with butter, and thermoses of cold milk. The sight of the milk thermoses created a moment of complete silence. Cold, fresh milk, served to enemy prisoners as casually as water. In Germany, milk had been reserved for small children and pregnant women since 1941. Most adults hadn't tasted it in years. Here it was poured into cups without ceremony, refilled without question. Friedrich drank his slowly, the cold creaminess coating his throat, trying to reconcile this moment with letters from home describing his sister growing thinner despite his mother's desperate efforts to find food. Around him, men who had commanded tanks in the desert, who had faced death without flinching, savoured milk like children at a birthday party. One sergeant, a veteran of Poland, France, and Africa, drained his cup and asked, through gestures and broken English, for more. Mrs. Anderson smiled and poured another cup without hesitation, as if milk was as plentiful as air. She also produced a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven, and passed them around. The prisoners held these cookies, butter, sugar, white flour combined into casual abundance, as if they were communion wafers. Some ate immediately, others wrapped them carefully in handkerchiefs to save for later, tangible proof of this impossible day. That evening, back at camp, mail call brought the first letters from home. The International Red Cross had forwarded mail from Germany, and Friedrich received a letter from his mother in Stuttgart. The paper was thin, poor quality, the envelope reused and resealed multiple times. Her handwriting, once firm and confident, now showed the shakiness of malnutrition and stress. She wrote of bombing raids that came nightly now, of queuing from dawn for a few potatoes only to find supplies exhausted, of his younger sister growing thinner despite her best efforts. She was proud he was alive, hoped the Americans were not treating him too harshly, prayed the war would end soon. Friedrich looked around the mess hall where he sat reading, at men eating pork chops with applesauce, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, rolls with butter. The contrast between his mother's reality and his own was so stark it created a physical pain in his chest. How could he write back and tell her that he ate better as a prisoner than she did as a free German citizen? How could he describe 3 meals a day when she was grateful for one? The guilt mixed with relief in a combination that would torment him for years. That evening, the prisoners discovered the camp canteen, a small store where they could spend their wage coupons. The shelves held impossibilities: candy bars, packages of cigarettes, razors and shaving cream, toothpaste, soap that smelled of lavender instead of lye, writing paper and envelopes, paperback books, and even small luxuries like hair pomade and aftershave. But what stopped them cold was a sign advertising ice cream, 5 cents. Soldiers were able to purchase ice cream or Coca-Cola, treats they hadn't had since childhood or had never tasted. The canteen had a small freezer containing ice cream bars, vanilla covered in chocolate, strawberry, plain chocolate. Ice cream, which required milk, sugar, refrigeration, all things that had become impossible in Germany, was available to prisoners of war for the equivalent of pennies. Hans Müller, who had been studying physics at Dresden University before the war swept him into the Afrika Korps, stood before the freezer case staring. He bought a vanilla bar with shaking hands, unwrapped it slowly, and took a bite. The cold sweetness exploded across his tongue, and he laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "We were told America was weak, decadent, divided by race hatred," he said to the others gathering around. "But they can waste. Milk and sugar on frozen treats for prisoners. What does that say about their real strength?" Others joined him, spending their carefully hoarded coupons on this impossible luxury. Some ate quickly, as if the ice cream might be taken away. Others ate slowly, trying to make it last, to extend this moment of sweetness in lives that had known too much bitterness. The presence of ice cream for purchase by enemy prisoners became a symbol of American abundance that no propaganda could explain away. If prisoners could buy ice cream, what luxuries did American soldiers enjoy? If a prison camp had electricity for freezers, what power did their factories command? As summer turned to autumn, the camp settled into a routine that felt surreal in its normalcy. Those who worked earned their wages, spent them at the canteen, wrote letters home through the Red Cross, attended English classes offered by American personnel, played soccer in the evenings, and tried to reconcile their new reality with everything they had believed. The camp had a library that grew weekly as local organizations donated books. Beyond German classics, there were American magazines and newspapers. Those who could read English discovered a world that contradicted every aspect of Nazi propaganda. The advertisements alone told a story of abundance that seemed fictional. Page after page showed cars, refrigerators, washing machines, clothing, food products in infinite variety. Even accounting for advertising exaggeration, the scale of American consumer culture was staggering. One advertisement for pet milk showed a smiling family around a table laden with food, with text proclaiming, "Milk for victory." In Germany, victory meant sacrifice. In America, apparently, it meant abundance shared even with enemies. Educational programs expanded as more prisoners showed interest. American officers gave lectures on various subjects: American history, agricultural techniques, business practices. The attendance grew as curiosity overcame suspicion. One lecture on American agriculture provided statistics that left the Germans speechless. The United States produced 2.3 billion bushels of corn annually. Germany's entire grain production, including conquered territories, was a fraction of that. American farms averaged 174 acres per farm. German farms averaged 20 acres. The mechanization was near total: tractors, combines, automated milking systems. "How can you produce so much?" asked Klaus Wagner, a former schoolteacher. The lecturer's answer was simple but revolutionary to German ears. Farmers owned their land, kept their profits, and were incentivized to produce more. The government supported them with research, education, and price supports. It was capitalism, but not the harsh exploitation they'd been taught to expect. It was a system designed to create abundance. Movies became popular entertainment, shown twice weekly in the recreation hall. Not propaganda films, but Hollywood entertainment. Musicals with elaborate dance numbers, comedies with well-fed actors, westerns with endless vistas of American landscape. Even the escapist entertainment revealed truths. A comedy showed a family complaining about meat rationing. They could only have steak twice a week. The German prisoners almost laughed at the bitter irony. In Germany, civilians hadn't seen steak in years. As autumn progressed, work details witnessed the American harvest. The scale was overwhelming. Combines moving through fields like great mechanical beasts, swallowing grain and leaving neat stubble behind. Trucks lined up to carry the harvest to grain elevators that rose like concrete cathedrals. At one farm, Friedrich's group helped with the corn harvest. The farmer had a mechanical picker that did the work of dozens of men. The corn was destined not just for human consumption, but for animal feed, another sign of abundance. America could afford to feed grain to cattle while Germans made bread from sawdust. Thanksgiving 1943 approached with the prisoners hearing rumors about this American holiday, but unprepared for the reality. Special meals for Thanksgiving and Christmas Day were mandated by the Geneva Convention, but the Americans interpreted special in a way that stunned their captives. The mess hall was transformed with decorations made by prisoners and guards together. Paper turkeys, cornucopias, autumn leaves cut from coloured paper. The smell of roasting turkey began before dawn, filling the camp with an aroma so rich it seemed physical. When the meal was served, it exceeded every expectation. Turkey, golden and glistening, carved at each table. Stuffing that combined bread, herbs and sausage in ways the Germans had never imagined. Mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream until they were clouds on the plate. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows, a combination that baffled the Germans, but which they ate with growing appreciation. Green beans, corn, peas, all swimming in butter. Cranberry sauce, tart and sweet. Rolls, biscuits, and of course, white bread. And then the desserts. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream, apple pie, pecan pie. Ice cream to accompany the pie for those who wanted it. Friedrich sat with his table mates, staring at a plate that held more food than his family would see in a week. Around him, hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps ate in silence, some openly weeping. The abundance was overwhelming, but it was the casualness of it that struck deepest. This wasn't a special show for propaganda purposes. This was simply how Americans celebrated their holiday, and they included their prisoners in the celebration as naturally as breathing. After dinner, some of the guards, relaxed by the holiday spirit, joined prisoners in the recreation area. Cigarettes were shared, not the precious hoarded tobacco of the front lines, but fresh packs of Lucky Strikes and Camels, passed around casually. One guard from Texas produced a guitar and played American folk songs. When he played Lily Marlene, a song beloved by soldiers on both sides, Germans and Americans sang together. The war momentarily dissolved in shared music. Christmas 1943 brought another wave of cognitive dissonance. Packages arrived from American charity organizations, not propaganda materials but practical gifts, socks, soap, razors, candy, cigarettes, and writing materials. Church groups sent Christmas cards with messages of peace. Local women's organizations baked cookies. The idea that enemy civilians would send gifts to prisoners was incomprehensible within the Nazi worldview, where enemies were to be destroyed, not comforted. The camp commander allowed the Germans to set up Christmas trees in each barracks. Fresh-cut pines appeared, filling the air with their scent. In Germany, families were lucky to find a branch to decorate. Here, full trees were provided to enemies. On Christmas Eve, both Catholic and Lutheran chaplains from nearby communities came to lead services. Enemy civilians ministering to enemy soldiers, praying for peace together. Christmas dinner surpassed even Thanksgiving. Turkey for those who wanted it, but also ham glazed with honey, roast beef for variety. Every side dish imaginable appeared. The desserts seemed to multiply. Cookies in festive shapes, cakes with real frosting, multiple varieties of pie. The mess hall was decorated with tinsel and lights, electric lights burning steadily in a display of power that was both festive and indicative of resources to waste. Some guards ate with the prisoners, sharing the meal in a gesture that would have been unthinkable in any German POW camp. There was even wine, real wine, a small cup for each man who wanted it. After dinner, the camp orchestra gave a concert, playing German carols that brought tears, but also American songs they had learned. White Christmas in accented English became a surreal anthem of captivity in the land of plenty. The new year of 1944 brought letters from home that made the contrast even starker. The bombing had intensified. Hamburg was in ruins. Berlin was under nightly attack. Food rations had been cut again. Fathers and brothers were being drafted into the Volkssturm. Meanwhile, the American newspapers in the camp library spoke of production records, of victory ships launched daily, of aircraft production that defied comprehension. The gap between American strength and German collapse was widening into a chasm. Work details continued through winter, some indoors at warehouses and factories. One group worked at a food processing plant, witnessing industrial-scale canning of vegetables. The volume was staggering, trucks arriving continuously with produce, assembly lines of workers, many of them women, processing food into cans that rolled off the line in an endless stream. The casual efficiency of it, turning abundance into preserved abundance, was another lesson in American organizational power. Spring 1944 brought new agricultural work as farms prepared for planting. Some prisoners who had been farmers in Germany were amazed by American farming methods. The use of fertilizer in quantities that would have been treasured in Germany, hybrid seeds that produced larger yields, irrigation systems that defied drought. At one demonstration, a county agent showed new techniques to local farmers, and the prisoners were allowed to watch. The assumption that there would be a future, that farming would continue to improve, that abundance could become even more abundant, was profoundly optimistic compared to the desperation of German agriculture. Camp Patrick Henry also served as a prisoner of war camp, housing over 5,000 German and Italian prisoners of war between 1944 and 1945. By mid-1944, Friedrich and many of his fellow prisoners had been transferred to Camp Patrick Henry proper, which was expanding to handle the increasing flow of POWs from the European theatre. The camp was massive, part of a complex that processed hundreds of thousands of American troops heading overseas, while simultaneously housing thousands of enemy prisoners. The irony was sharp. American soldiers departing to invade Europe, while European soldiers worked the Virginia fields. But there was no animosity between the groups. The POWs were just another part of the war machine, processing smoothly through the system. Work details from Camp Patrick Henry spread throughout the region, harvesting crops, maintaining military facilities, working in factories converted to war production. Summer 1944 brought news of the Normandy invasion. The guards were jubilant but not vindictive. Work continued, meals were served, life in the camp went on. Some prisoners began to realize that their war was effectively over, that Germany would lose, that they were the lucky ones who would survive. Others clung to hope of German miracle weapons or last-minute reversals. But the evidence of American strength was too overwhelming to deny. The camp's educational programs expanded. Some prisoners began correspondence courses with American universities. Prisoners eventually studied through 103 universities and technical schools. The idea that enemy prisoners could earn college credit while captive was so absurd that many didn't believe it until the course materials actually arrived. Mathematics, engineering, agriculture, business, all available to men who were supposed to be enemies of the state. As summer turned to autumn, the harvest season brought work on farms throughout Virginia. The abundance was even more pronounced than the previous year. Corn yields were up, tobacco crops were healthy, truck farms produced vegetables in quantities that seemed impossible. At one farm, the prisoners helped harvest apples, working in orchards heavy with fruit. The farmer's wife brought lunch as usual: sandwiches, milk, cookies, and fresh apple pie made from the harvest. The circle of abundance, from field to table, even for enemy prisoners, was complete. Thanksgiving 1944 exceeded even the previous year. The mess hall cooks, now including experienced German prisoners who had volunteered for kitchen duty, prepared a feast that would have fed a German village for a week. If experienced cooks were among the prisoners, the food might have been better than what their captors ate. Turkey, ham, and roast beef were all options. The variety of side dishes had doubled. Desserts covered entire tables. Some American guards ate with the prisoners, sharing the meal as if nationality meant nothing in the face of abundance. Christmas 1944 was bittersweet. News from Germany was catastrophic. Cities in ruins, the Wehrmacht in retreat on all fronts, civilians fleeing the advancing Soviets. Yet in Camp Patrick Henry, Christmas was celebrated with the same abundance as the previous year. Fresh trees, decorations, presents from charity organizations, and a feast that defied description. The contrast between their family's Christmas, if they were still alive to celebrate it, and their own was a guilt that no amount of food could assuage. Winter 1944-45 passed with a sense of ending. The war was clearly in its final stages. Some prisoners began planning for after. What would they do when they returned to a destroyed nation? Those taking American courses imagined using their education to rebuild. Others, more cynical, wondered if there would be anything left to rebuild. The camp routine continued unchanged, as if feeding and housing enemy prisoners was sustainable indefinitely. Spring 1945 brought visible changes to the American landscape as the war clearly neared its end. Factories that had produced military equipment began retooling for civilian production. The assumption of victory, of a prosperous peace to follow, was everywhere. Work details helped farmers prepare for what many said would be the biggest planting season ever, anticipating the need to feed a hungry world after the war. May 8, 1945, brought Germany's surrender. In the camp, the reaction was muted. No celebration among the prisoners, no despair either, just a numbed acceptance. Work details continued. Meals were served. The camp routine proceeded as if the end of the European war was just another day. But that evening, the camp commander authorized a special meal to mark the end of fighting in Europe. Steak appeared, thick, juicy, cooked to order. The casual ability to produce luxury food for thousands of prisoners on short notice was a final demonstration of American abundance. In the following weeks, the prisoners were shown films from liberated concentration camps. The skeletal figures, the mass graves, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Some prisoners refused to believe it, claiming it was propaganda. Others, remembering things they had seen or heard but dismissed, felt the full weight of complicity. They had fought for a regime that starved and murdered millions while they complained about the monotony of eating beef too often. The moral inversion was complete. Summer 1945 passed strangely. The war with Japan continued, but for the European prisoners, it was over. They worked American fields and factories, ate American food, some continuing their education. The camp routine was so established it seemed permanent. In August, atomic bombs ended the Pacific War. The prisoners learned of weapons that could destroy entire cities, the ultimate expression of American technological supremacy. Repatriation began in autumn 1945. The prisoners were processed for return to Europe, though many expressed reluctance. They had gained weight, learned skills, some had even developed friendships with guards and civilian workers. They were leaving a land of plenty for a homeland in ruins. Ships that had brought American soldiers home now carried Germans back across the Atlantic. Friedrich's last meal in America was Thanksgiving dinner, 1945. The camp, preparing to close, still provided the traditional feast. He ate slowly, trying to memorize flavors he might never taste again. Turkey, stuffing, all the traditional sides, and pie with ice cream. Around him, other prisoners did the same, storing up sense memories against the hunger they knew awaited them. The journey home was a transition between worlds. American rations gave way to British, then to whatever could be found in European ports. By the time they reached Bremerhaven, they were eating thin soup and black bread, as if the past 2 years had been a dream. But their health, their weight gain, marked them as different from the skeletal figures meeting them. Germany was worse than the darkest letters had suggested. Cities were rubble, refugees everywhere. The prisoners, healthy from American abundance, were viewed with suspicion. They had eaten ice cream while Germany died. Friedrich found his family in Stuttgart, living in a basement, his brother dead in the war's final days. They were surviving on less than 1,000 calories a day. He had gained 30 pounds as a prisoner. He tried to explain America, the abundance, the ice cream, the casual waste. They listened but couldn't truly comprehend. Their reality was searching for fuel and food. His was choosing between chocolate and vanilla. Other returning prisoners faced similar disconnection. They had seen America not as propaganda portrayed, but as it actually was. Powerful beyond measure, wealthy beyond imagination, confident enough to be kind. Many used their American education to find work with occupation forces. Some started businesses, applying American methods to German problems. Others emigrated when possible, returning to the land of their captivity as immigrants. They had learned English, absorbed American culture, experienced democracy's disorder that somehow produced more than dictatorship's discipline. Years later, Friedrich would remember not the battles or the ideology, but the taste of that first white bread sandwich, the shock of ice cream available to prisoners, the abundance that defeated certainty more thoroughly than any army. He had been a warrior of the master race, defeated by casual kindness and impossible plenty. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army, and not the Russian one prisoner would later write, echoing the thoughts of thousands who had expected death and tasted ice cream instead. The ice cream in the end was more than a treat. It was a symbol of everything, a society so productive it could waste resources on enemy pleasure, so confident it could be generous to those who had tried to destroy it. Every spoonful had been a lesson in what real power looked like. Not the power to conquer, but the power to create abundance so vast it could be casually shared. They had prepared for American brutality and met American ice cream. The sweetness of that reversal would linger long after the last camp closed and the last prisoner went home to rebuild from ruins. Friedrich lived to see Germany rebuild, to see prosperity return beyond what anyone in 1945 could have imagined. He married, raised children, and built a modest business using skills learned in America. But he never forgot those years as a prisoner when enemies fed him. Better than his homeland could feed its own. He kept a small notebook where he had written down his first impressions of America, the taste of that first white bread sandwich, the shock of ice cream in winter, the abundance that seemed impossible. In his later years, when his grandchildren would visit, he would sometimes take them for ice cream. They would debate flavors with the casual entitlement of those who had never known scarcity, complaining if the serving was too small or the flavor not quite right. He would say nothing, just smile and remember when a single spoonful of vanilla had tasted like defeat and education combined, when enemy kindness had unmanned him more than enemy bullets ever could. He thought often of that first chocolate bar, carefully saved and savored in the darkness of a Virginia barracks. He thought of Thanksgiving dinners that fed prisoners better than German Christmas feasts. He thought of American farmers' wives pouring milk for enemies while German children went without. These memories were not bitter anymore, just instructive. They had taught him that real strength lay not in conquest, but in creation, not in taking, but in having so much you could afford to give. When people asked him about the war, he rarely spoke of battles or ideology. Instead, he would tell them about ice cream on hot Virginia afternoons, about white bread that dissolved like clouds on his tongue, about chocolate bars handed to men expecting execution. He would tell them how America had defeated not just German armies, but German certainty, one meal at a time, one small kindness at a time, proving with every scoop of ice cream that abundance was more powerful than ideology. The prisoners of Camp Patrick Henry and hundreds of other camps across America had learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. They had been prepared for American brutality and instead encountered American generosity. They had expected starvation and received abundance. They had anticipated death and tasted ice cream. It was a reversal so complete, so unexpected, that it changed not just their view of America, but their understanding of what strength really meant. In the end, they were defeated not by American armies, though those played their part, but by American ice cream, by the casual demonstration of a power so great it could waste resources on enemy comfort. They returned to Germany carrying this knowledge like a secret, the taste of chocolate and vanilla a permanent reminder that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. Real power fed its enemies ice cream. Real power shared its abundance. Real power was so confident in its strength that it could afford to be kind. This was the lesson of Camp Patrick Henry, of Camp Herne, of Camp Algona, of all the camps where German prisoners discovered that their enemies' cruelty consisted of too much food rather than too little. It was a lesson written in white bread and chocolate, taught through Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas feasts, proven with every scoop of ice cream served to men who had expected bullets. They had been warriors of the master race, convinced of their superiority, certain of their destiny. They had been defeated by abundance, transformed by kindness, educated by ice cream. The last German prisoners left American camps in 1946, but they carried with them memories that would last lifetimes. Memories of a nation so wealthy it could be wasteful, so strong it could be gentle, so confident it could treat enemies better than their own system treated its people. They had tasted the future in those camps, a future where power meant prosperity shared rather than resources hoarded, where strength meant building rather than destroying, where victory meant having so much you could give it away. Years later, decades later, in a prosperous and democratic Germany, the last survivors of those camps would gather sometimes to remember. They would laugh about their attempts to play baseball, their confusion at Thanksgiving sweet potatoes with marshmallows, their amazement at ice cream in winter. But underneath the laughter was something deeper, gratitude for the accident of capture by Americans rather than Soviets, wonder at an enemy's kindness that had saved not just their lives, but their understanding of what civilization could be. They had gone to America as prisoners and returned as witnesses. Witnesses to abundance, to kindness, to the power of having enough to share. They had expected death and received chocolate. They had prepared for brutality and encountered white bread. They had steeled themselves for execution and instead tasted ice cream. In every bite, every meal, every small comfort provided to enemies, they had learned what real victory looked like. It looked like having so much you could afford to be generous. It looked like power expressed through plenty rather than privation. It looked like ice cream for enemies, chocolate for the defeated, white bread for those who had tried to destroy you. This was their story, the story of men who went to war for hatred and learned about kindness, who fought for an ideology of scarcity and discovered the power of abundance, who expected death and tasted ice cream instead. It was a story written in sugar and cream, in chocolate and white flour, in all the small abundances that revealed great truths. They had been defeated not by American armies, but by American ice cream. And in that sweet defeat, they had learned more about power, about strength, about what it meant to truly win, than all their years of fighting had ever taught them. The camps closed, the prisoners went home, the war became history. But the lessons remained, sweet and cold and true as that first impossible taste of ice cream in a Virginia prison camp, where enemies were fed better than friends, where abundance defeated ideology one spoonful at a time, where warriors of the master race learned that real mastery meant having so much you could share it with those who had tried to destroy you. They had prepared for American brutality. They had met American ice cream. The difference between what they expected and what they experienced was the difference between the system they had fought for and the one that had defeated them. It was the difference between scarcity and abundance, between cruelty and kindness, between an ideology that starved its own people and a democracy that fed its enemies ice cream. That was their story. That was their lesson. That was the taste that would never leave them. Sweet, cold, impossible, true. They had been prisoners of war who became prisoners of abundance, captives of kindness, men defeated by ice cream and transformed by the simple, devastating fact that their enemies had treated them better than their own system had ever treated anyone. They had learned, one spoonful at a time, what real power looked like. It looked like ice cream for enemies. It looked like abundance shared. It looked like victory so complete you could afford to be kind. The camps closed. The prisoners went home, the war became history. But the lessons remained, sweet and cold and true as that first impossible taste of ice cream in a Virginia prison camp, where enemies were fed better than friends, where abundance defeated ideology one spoonful at a time, where warriors of the master race learned that real mastery meant having so much you could share it with those who had tried to destroy you. They had prepared for American brutality. They had met American ice cream. The difference between what they expected and what they experienced was the difference between the system they had fought for and the one that had defeated them. It was the difference between scarcity and abundance, between cruelty and kindness, between an ideology that starved its own people and a democracy that fed its enemies ice cream. That was their story. That was their lesson. That was the taste that would never leave them. Sweet, cold, impossible, true. They had been prisoners of war who became prisoners of abundance, captives of kindness, men defeated by ice cream and transformed by the simple, devastating fact that their enemies had treated them better than their own system had ever treated anyone. They had learned, one spoonful at a time, what real power looked like. It looked like ice cream for enemies. It looked like abundance shared. It looked like victory so complete you could afford to be kind. When the last of them passed away, peacefully in their beds in a free and prosperous Germany, they left behind more than memories. They left behind a truth learned in prison camps where the greatest hardship was choosing between chocolate and vanilla, where the most difficult decision was whether to save or savor that day's candy bar, where men who had marched for conquest learned that real victory tasted like ice cream on a hot Virginia afternoon, served by enemies who had already won the only war that mattered, the war between abundance and want, between kindness and cruelty, between systems that fed their prisoners and systems that starved their own. They had arrived as believers in force and left as witnesses to generosity. They had come as conquerors and departed as students of a power greater than any army, the power to give when you could take, to feed when you could starve, to show mercy when you could show might. Every scoop of ice cream had been a lesson. Every slice of white bread had been an education. Every chocolate bar had been a small, sweet demolition of everything they thought they knew about strength. In the end, they were not defeated by American bombs or bullets, though those played their part. They were defeated by American ice cream, by the devastating kindness of abundance shared with enemies, by the simple fact that a nation they had tried to destroy had fed them better than their own ever could. It was a defeat more complete than any military loss, a victory more total than any battlefield triumph. They had learned the final lesson of power, that true strength could afford to be sweet, that real victory tasted like chocolate, that the greatest conquest was having so much you could give it to those who had tried to take everything from you. That was the legacy of the German prisoners who ate ice cream in America while their homeland burned. Not bitterness, but understanding. Not hatred, but recognition. Not the memory of captivity, but the memory of kindness. They had tasted the future in those camps, a future where power meant prosperity, where strength meant sharing, where victory meant abundance for all, even for enemies. They had expected death and received ice cream. In that exchange, in that impossible sweetness, they had discovered what civilization could be when it was strong enough to be kind. The story ends where it began, with men expecting brutality and finding ice cream, with warriors prepared for death-tasting chocolate instead, with an ideology of hatred melting like vanilla on the tongue. They went home to rebuild not just their cities, but their understanding of what nations could be when they were truly strong. They had learned in American prison camps what German victory could never have taught them, that real power, lasting power, the only power that mattered, was the power to turn enemies into witnesses of your abundance, to defeat hatred with ice cream, to win so completely that you could afford to be kind. That was their gift to the future, the knowledge that strength and kindness were not opposites but partners, that abundance shared was more powerful than scarcity hoarded, that feeding your enemies was the ultimate expression of victory. They had gone to war for the master race, and discovered that mastery meant having masters who would give ice cream to their prisoners. They had fought for a 1,000-year Reich and found that eternity tasted like chocolate on a summer afternoon in Virginia, where enemies fed enemies and called it normal, where abundance was so common it could be wasted on kindness, where prisoners of war became prisoners of generosity and never wanted to escape. The German prisoners of American camps carried this truth home in their bodies, 30 pounds heavier, and in their souls, immeasurably lighter. They had learned that ice cream could defeat armies, that chocolate could conquer hatred, that white bread could demolish certainty more thoroughly than any weapon. They had discovered that true victory didn't march or shoot or conquer. True victory served ice cream to its enemies and called it Tuesday. True victory had so much it could afford to share. True victory was sweet and cold and generous, and it tasted like America. The German prisoners of American camps carried this truth home in their bodies, 30 pounds heavier, and in their souls, immeasurably lighter. They had learned that ice cream could defeat armies, that chocolate could conquer hatred, that white bread could demolish certainty more thoroughly than any weapon. They had discovered that true victory didn't march or shoot or conquer. True victory served ice cream to its enemies and called it Tuesday. True victory had so much it could afford to share. True victory was sweet and cold and generous, and it tasted like America. In the decades that followed, as Germany rose from the ashes to become a prosperous democracy, those who had tasted American ice cream as prisoners became quiet ambassadors of a different kind of strength. They raised children who would never know hunger, in a nation that would never again mistake cruelty for power. When their grandchildren complained about flavors at the ice cream shop, they smiled and said nothing, remembering when one spoonful of vanilla had been a revolution, when enemy kindness had taught them more about strength than all their training in hatred ever had. Some wrote memoirs that few read, trying to explain how ice cream could be more powerful than ideology, how abundance could defeat armies more thoroughly than bullets. Most simply lived their lives, carrying within them the memory of a time when they had expected death and tasted chocolate, when they had prepared for brutality and met white bread, when they had been enemies fed better than friends by a nation so strong it could afford to be kind. Friedrich Hoffmann lived to be 93. On his deathbed, his children asked if he had any regrets from the war. He thought for a long moment, then smiled. "Only one," he said. "I never thanked the American sergeant who handed me that first chocolate bar. He gave me more than candy that day. He gave me the rest of my life and the knowledge of what real strength looks like. It looks like giving chocolate to your enemies. It looks like having so much you can afford to be kind." His daughter held his hand as he closed his eyes for the last time, still tasting that impossible sweetness from a summer day in 1943, when everything he believed had melted like ice cream in the Virginia sun, when enemies had fed him better than his own nation could feed its children, when he learned that true power was measured not in what you could take, but in what you could afford to give away. The last German prisoner of war from the American camps died in 2009, taking with him the living memory of a time when ice cream had defeated the master race, when chocolate had conquered hatred, when kindness had proven stronger than all the armies of the Reich. But the lesson lived on, sweet and true. Real strength feeds its enemies ice cream. Real power shares its abundance. Real victory is so complete it can afford to be kind. And somewhere in Virginia, where Camp Patrick Henry once stood, where thousands of German prisoners had learned that their enemies' cruelty consisted of too much food rather than too little, the land remembers. It remembers men who arrived expecting death and departed understanding life, who came as conquerors and left as witnesses to abundance, who prepared for American brutality and met American ice cream instead. That was the final victory, sweeter than any battlefield triumph, turning enemies into advocates through abundance, defeating hatred with ice cream, winning so completely that the defeated would spend the rest of their lives telling their children about the strength of kindness, the power of generosity, the devastating effectiveness of feeding your enemies better than they had ever fed themselves. The war ended. The camps closed. The prisoners went home. But the taste remained. Chocolate and vanilla, abundance and kindness, the flavor of a victory so complete it could afford to share its spoils with those who had tried to destroy it. They had been defeated not by American armies, but by American ice cream. And in that sweet defeat, they had won something greater than any military victory. The knowledge that true strength tastes like ice cream shared with enemies, that real power is measured in scoops of kindness, that the greatest victory of all is having so much you can give it to those who have nothing, not even hope, and call it normal. That was America's secret weapon in the camps of World War II. Not brutality, but abundance, not cruelty, but ice cream, not hatred, but the casual, devastating kindness of a nation so strong it could feed its enemies dessert. The German prisoners never recovered from that assault of generosity. They surrendered not to force but to kindness, defeated not by arms but by ice cream, conquered not by might but by the simple, world-changing fact that their enemies treated them better than their own system had ever treated anyone. They went home to build a new Germany on that foundation, a Germany that would feed its people instead of starving them, that would share abundance instead of hoarding scarcity, that would measure strength in prosperity given rather than territory taken. They built it one memory at a time, one story at a time, one shared understanding at a time. Real victory tastes like ice cream. Real power looks like abundance shared. Real strength is sweet and cold and generous, and it defeats hatred more thoroughly than any army ever could. The story of German prisoners eating ice cream in America while their homeland burned was, in the end, the story of how kindness conquered hatred, how abundance defeated ideology, how ice cream won the war in ways that tanks and planes never could. It was the story of men who expected brutality and met generosity, who prepared for death and tasted life, who arrived as enemies and departed as witnesses to what the world could be when strength meant kindness and victory meant having enough to share. That was their legacy to the future, the knowledge that ice cream could defeat armies, that chocolate could conquer ideologies, that feeding your enemies was the ultimate expression of power. They had learned it one spoonful at a time in American prison camps, where the greatest hardship was abundance, where the only torture was kindness, where men who had marched for the master race discovered that true mastery meant having so much you could give it away and call it nothing special. The last lesson of the last war was the sweetest. Victory tastes like ice cream shared with enemies. Power looks like chocolate bars for prisoners. Strength is measured not in what you can destroy, but in what you can afford to give to those who tried to destroy you. The German prisoners of American camps learned this lesson and carried it home in their hearts and on their tongues, the taste of impossible kindness that would never leave them, the flavor of a future where enemies could become friends over something as simple and revolutionary as a scoop of vanilla on a hot summer day. That was how the war really ended. Not with bombs or signatures, but with ice cream, not with vengeance, but with vanilla, not with cruelty, but with the casual kindness of a nation so strong it could feed its enemies dessert and call it policy. The German prisoners never stood a chance against that kind of power. They surrendered to sweetness, capitulated to chocolate, gave up in the face of generosity so complete it made resistance not just futile, but absurd. And that was the final truth they carried home. They had not been defeated by America's armies, but by America's ice cream. They had not lost to American strength, but to American kindness. They had not been conquered by force, but by the simple, devastating fact that their enemies had treated them better than they had ever treated anyone, had fed them ice cream while their own people starved, had shown them what real victory looked like. It looked like having so much you could waste it on kindness. It looked like being so strong you could afford to be gentle. It looked like winning so completely that you could feed ice cream to your enemies and know that in doing so, you had defeated not just their armies, but their ideas, not just their present, but their future, not just their bodies, but their hearts. That was the legacy of the ice cream in the prison camps, the knowledge that kindness was the ultimate weapon, that generosity was the final victory, that feeding your enemies was the surest way to defeat them forever. The German prisoners learned this lesson in Virginia and Texas and camps across America, learned it in chocolate and vanilla, learned it in abundance they had never imagined possible. They took that lesson home and built a new world on it, a world where strength meant prosperity shared, where power meant kindness given, where victory meant having so much you could afford to feed your former enemies and call them friends. It all started with ice cream in a prison camp, with chocolate bars for men expecting death, with the simple revolutionary act of treating enemies better than they had ever treated their own. That was how America won the war that mattered most. Not the war of armies, but the war of ideas. Not the war of territory, but the war of possibility. Not the war of conquest, but the war of kindness. They won it with ice cream. They won it with abundance. They won it by being so strong they could afford to be sweet. And in the end, that was all that needed to be said. They came expecting brutality and met ice cream. Everything else followed from that impossible kindness, that revolutionary generosity, that world-changing moment when enemies fed enemies and called it normal. The rest was just history, sweet and cold and true as ice cream on a summer afternoon in Virginia, where German prisoners learned that they had lost the war the moment they tasted American kindness, and won something better in return, the knowledge of what the world could be when the strong were kind and victory tasted like vanilla. And in the end, that was all that needed to be said. They came expecting brutality and met ice cream. Everything else followed from that impossible kindness, that revolutionary generosity, that world-changing moment when enemies fed enemies and called it normal. The rest was just history, sweet and cold and true as ice cream on a summer afternoon in Virginia, where German prisoners learned that they had lost the war the moment they tasted American kindness and won something better in return, the knowledge of what the world could be when the strong were kind and victory tasted like vanilla. The very last of the Afrika Korps veterans who had tasted ice cream in American camps passed away in 2012, a man named Friedrich Hoffmann, who had spent his final years in a Munich nursing home. The nurses found in his bedside drawer a carefully preserved wrapper from a Hershey bar, brown and brittle with age. His grandson, when called to collect his effects, held the wrapper with confusion. "He kept this for 70 years, he asked. The nurse, an older woman who had heard Werner's stories many times, nodded. "He said it was the most important thing he owned." said it reminded him that enemies could be kind, that hatred wasn't forever, that sometimes losing a war meant winning something better. The grandson, raised in prosperity and democracy, could not understand how a candy wrapper could carry such weight. But for Werner and thousands like him, that wrapper was proof of a miracle, the miracle of enemies who fed rather than starved, who gave rather than took, who showed that strength could be sweet and power could be kind. With Werner's death, the living memory passed into history. But the lesson lived on in the Germany they had helped to build, a nation that had learned from their stories that real strength meant sharing abundance, that true victory meant turning enemies into friends, that lasting power was measured not in what you could destroy, but in what you could create and give away. The camps where they had learned these lessons were long gone. Camp Patrick Henry had become an airport. Camp Herne was farmland again. Camp Algona had left only a small museum and a nativity scene carved by prisoners who had too much time and too much food and nothing to do but create beauty where they had expected to find only ugliness. But in every German city where former prisoners had settled, in every family where their stories had been told, in every child who grew up hearing about ice cream in prison camps, the lesson lived on. They had been the last generation to believe that cruelty was strength and conquest was victory. Their children would know better, because they had tasted American ice cream and learned that kindness could conquer more thoroughly than any army. The final monument to their experience was not built in stone, but in the choices of their descendants. Every time Germany chose cooperation over conflict, every time it fed the hungry instead of conquering the weak, every time it measured its strength in what it could give rather than what it could take, the ghosts of Camp Patrick Henry smiled. They had learned their lesson well. Those men who expected bullets and received chocolate, who prepared for death and tasted ice cream. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not that America had defeated Germany, but that through ice cream and kindness, through abundance shared with enemies, through the simple act of treating prisoners better than they had ever been treated, America had helped create the Germany that would become its ally and friend. The transformation had begun not in conference rooms or battlefields, but in mess halls where enemies ate together, in canteens where prisoners bought ice cream, in moments when kindness dissolved hatred as surely as chocolate melted on the tongue. The last word belonged not to generals or politicians, but to Friedrich Hoffmann, who had written in his diary on his last night in Camp Patrick Henry, "We came as conquerors and leave as converts. We arrived as enemies and depart as witnesses. We expected death and discovered life. How does a nation defeat its enemies so completely? It feeds them ice cream. It gives them chocolate. It shows them kindness they don't deserve and can never forget. We will go home and build a new Germany, and it will be built on the memory of American ice cream, on the knowledge that real strength is sweet and real victory is shared. They have conquered us with kindness. We will never recover. We will never forget. We will never be the same." And they never were. The warriors of the master race had been mastered by ice cream, conquered by chocolate, defeated by a kindness so complete it changed not just their lives, but their nation's future. They had learned the last lesson of the last war, that in the end, the only victories that matter are the ones that turn enemies into friends, hatred into understanding, scarcity into abundance shared. The American ice cream had won a victory more complete than any army could achieve. It had changed hearts, transformed minds, rewritten futures. One spoonful at a time, one prisoner at a time, one small act of kindness at a time, it had proven that the strongest nations are those that can afford to be generous, that the greatest victories are those that leave no enemies behind, that the sweetest triumphs are those that everyone can taste. That was the story of the German prisoners who expected execution and received ice cream instead. They had lost a war and won an education. They had surrendered their arms and recovered their humanity. They had prepared for American brutality and met American abundance, and in that meeting, in that moment, when the first spoonful of impossible sweetness touched their tongues, the future changed. The future tasted like ice cream. The future looked like enemies feeding enemies. The future was sweeter than the past, kinder than the present, more abundant than anything they had imagined possible. They had found it in American prison camps, served in paper bowls, 5 cents at the canteen, available to anyone, even to those who had come to destroy. That was their gift to the world, the knowledge that kindness could conquer, that generosity could defeat armies, that ice cream could change history. They had learned it as prisoners and taught it as free men. They had tasted it in Virginia and carried it home to Germany. They had discovered that the war's greatest secret weapon was not a bomb or a tank, but a scoop of vanilla on a hot afternoon, shared between enemies who would one day be friends. The story ends where it began, with men expecting the worst and finding the best, with warriors prepared for death discovering life, with enemies meeting kindness so profound it changed everything. They had come to America as prisoners of war and left as prisoners of hope, captured not by chains, but by chocolate, held not by walls, but by the memory of abundance shared, defeated not by force, but by the simple, revolutionary fact that their enemies had treated them better than their own system ever could. That was the final victory of the ice cream in the camps. It had turned the last war into the beginning of a lasting peace, had transformed enemies into allies, had proven once and for all that the strongest nations are those that share their strength, that the greatest powers are those that empower others, that the sweetest victories are those that everyone can taste. The German prisoners of World War II had learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. They had tasted American power and found it sweet. They had experienced American victory and found it kind. They had expected American brutality and found American ice cream, and in that finding, in that impossible generosity, they had discovered what the world could be when the strong chose kindness over cruelty, abundance over scarcity, ice cream over ideology. That was their story, and they were sticking to it, sweet and cold and true, forever and always. They had been defeated by ice cream, conquered by kindness, transformed by the simple fact that their enemies had fed them better than their friends. It was the strangest defeat in military history and the most complete victory in human history. It was the war that ended with dessert, the conquest that tasted like chocolate, the transformation that began with a single scoop of vanilla in a Virginia prison camp where German warriors learned that American strength was sweet and American victory was meant to be shared. They never recovered from that kindness. They never forgot that abundance. They never stopped being grateful that they had been captured by an enemy who measured victory in ice cream served and chocolate shared, who proved that real power looked like feeding your enemies, who showed that true strength was sweet enough to share with those who had tried to destroy you. That was how the war really ended. Not with a bang, but with a bite. Not with violence, but with vanilla. Not with cruelty, but with kindness so casual it redefined strength forever. The German prisoners had lost to American armies, but they had been conquered by American ice cream. And in that sweet defeat, they had found a victory greater than any their ideology had promised. The victory of becoming fully human again, of learning that enemies could be friends, that hatred was not forever, that the future could taste better than the past. They were the last to learn it and the first to teach it. Real victory tastes like ice cream shared with enemies. Real power looks like abundance given away. Real strength is measured in kindness, shown to those who deserve it least and need it most. They had learned it in American prison camps where the only torture was too much food and the only cruelty was excessive kindness. They had tasted the future there, and it was sweeter than they had ever dared to dream. That was their legacy to the world, the knowledge that ice cream could end wars better than armies, that chocolate could conquer hatred more thoroughly than violence, that feeding your enemies was the surest way to transform them into friends. They had been the unlikely students of this impossible lesson, warriors of hatred who graduated as ambassadors of kindness, soldiers of scarcity who became witnesses to abundance, prisoners of war who discovered that the only chains that mattered were the ones that bound people to cruelty instead of kindness. They had arrived in America expecting death and departed understanding life. They had come as conquerors and left as converts. They had prepared for brutality and met ice cream, and in that meeting, in that moment of impossible sweetness, the world changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, surely, one scoop at a time, one story at a time, one transformed life at a time. That was the final truth. They had been prisoners of war who became prisoners of peace, captives of hatred who became volunteers of love, men who expected the worst and received the best, and spent the rest of their lives trying to live up to the kindness they had never deserved and could never forget. They had been defeated by American ice cream, and it was the sweetest defeat in history, the kindest conquest ever recorded, the only war that ended with everyone winning because everyone got dessert.